Today, I'm gonna level up your animation game by showing you exactly how to make the retro Netflix animation in DaVinci Resolve. We're gonna cover a lesser-known technique for seamless text animation, cover some of the fundamentals when it comes to lighting and rendering 3D scenes, and how to think creatively so that you can get the results you want. Let's jump in, shall we? So how are we going to start off by making this? Well, the way that we started was obviously with a text 3D node. And the font that we're using today is actually Open Sans, which I'm pretty sure every computer has. So we're switching our font from regular to bold. And then because our text is 3D and we're going to have our letters moving out, we're going to need more than just the normal backing on our text, which is like flat like this. So we brought our extrusion depth all the way up to 1. And then to also give a little bit of an edge to our text, you can see kind of the white line right here. Let me zoom right in on it. It looks like we have just a tiny bit of a bevel. And so I wanted to add the same thing on our text. You can see our bevel right there. So we brought our bevel depth up and our bevel width up. We also increased our smoothing angle all the way to 60, and we added our bevel to the front and the back. Now we'll get into the actual positioning for our text, how we're going to make sure that it stays in the center of the screen in just a moment. First, we're going to go into our shading tab, and I want you to direct your attention to the inspector here for a moment. You can see that unlike a normal text plus node, we've got a whole bunch of color controls here. The main one, of course, being our material color. And this is where the magic is going to happen. If this was a normal text plus node, then this would be the normal color. And so what we did is we went to the exact frame where our reference Netflix goes from white to red, and we just changed our bevel color from white to roughly the same red that we see in our reference. As it also shrunk down a little bit, we increased it all the way up to white as well, just to help give it a little bit more impact when it finally turns. So we go whoop, just like that. Now we'll get to the specular, the bevel color, and the specular color when we do our lighting. And so now, all the way at the bottom, we're going to make some adjustments to our size. Now, you probably noticed that your Open Sans looks different than my Open Sans, and that is because this is what Open Sans Bold normally looks like. Which is not very impressive. So we just took our size, we brought our Y up a whole bunch and our X up just a tiny bit so that we have something that looks a lot closer to our reference. Now, here is where the magic happens. The way that we're going to animate our letters is not with normal keyframing. Now, you'll notice obviously that each letter is moving individually. And when you have a 3D object in Fusion, you usually have to move the entire thing all at once. All at once, that is, unless you use the follower modifier. Now, the follower modifier, I believe, is only specific to the text nodes. And the way we can add it on is by right-clicking in our box here, and we'll come down to where it says follower, and we'll just click that, and we're going to click it. Now, once you have the follower modifier active, you're going to notice a keyframe will appear active on your styled text box area. And if you go to modifiers, you can click on follower 3D, and now we can begin using a really good tool that saves us a ton of time. Now, what does the follower modifier actually do? Well, you're looking at it. It makes each piece of our text follow each other, but with a delay. And there's a lot of different controls here. You can change the range of characters that get affected by the follower modifier. You can change the order, even the delay type. And this is just one part of the modifier. We also have a text area where we can adjust the size, and we also have a transform area, which is where we're going to be doing the majority of our work. Now, when we take a look at our reference again, you'll notice that the delay between characters does actually get shorter, which means that we can't just have one static delay for every single character. We need to start off with a larger delay between the N and the E, and then shorten it as we get to the end of the word. This is what our styled text delay looks like, where we have a big delay between the N and the E, and then we quickly shorten it down until finally the whole thing goes to 0, because when our text moves back right here, we don't want any delay at all. So just to watch that through with our spline right here. Easy peasy. Now that's all well and good, but how are we actually animating this thing? Like, what do the controls actually look like? The control we're animating is our offset Z. X and Y will move you left and right, up and down. The offset Z is what's actually pulling us forward and back. So if we get rid of our delay here and we just add in our character offset, here is what our spline is looking like, where everything is slowly moving in, and then right as all of our letters come in, we start to move back and zoom in just like that. And this is probably something that a lot of people are not going to tell you, is that when you are attempting to recreate something or to make an animation flow, to make it look and feel really, really good, you're gonna have to play around with your spline graph a whole bunch. And I'm not talking about just the basic text animations. I'm talking about something like this, where you need very, very specific animation and timing and smoothness and whatever else. So after our Netflix text goes from white to red, it does continue to shrink a little bit. And you'll notice that our text is just not doing that. And that is where our Transform 3D node comes in. Now, I actually started this all the way back at frame 15. And this was such a simple piece of the animation that I decided to do it on a separate node so that I can make any kind of extra adjustments I might want. If I want it to go smaller, if I want the transition from the letters animating to just the shrinkage to be a little bit different, like if I want it to move a little bit further up or a little bit further down. So I actually start shrinking it from frame 15, then we hit a keyframe right about here, and then I also start moving our text down just a little bit, because as you can see in our reference, not only does our text get smaller, but it does shrink and move down ever so slightly. So all we're doing is animating our Y translation along with our scale, and that helps to complete the animation. Just like that. All right, now we get into the fun part. We get into the thing that, after our animation, is probably the most important of the entire effect, and that is our lighting and our background. Now we're gonna make the background first because it's really, really easy to do. Then we'll make it 3D and we'll move on to lighting the entire scene. What we did is we took a nice white background here. We also took a kind of darker bluish reddish background. Then we simply merged the two over top of each other, and then we took an ellipse node, we plug that into our bluish red background, and then we're gonna bring our soft edge up a whole bunch. We're gonna increase our width and height, and then we're going to click invert. Otherwise we end up with something like this, which we don't want. We want our darker areas to be on the outskirts of our background and not on the inside. So all of that gets plugged into an image plane 3D, and then we can begin arranging everything so that our text and our lights interact with our background. And so because our letters are pushing straight through from behind the background, that is exactly how we have everything animated right here. So you'll see in our text 3D, our Z translation property actually has us moved back. Otherwise, we end up with something like this, which starts us off in front of our background. So we're starting off a little bit behind the background so that when we animate forward and we finally pull back, we end up with our red text basically flush with the background to the point where you really can't tell that it isn't flat anymore. So now that we have our text and our background set up, it's time to finally bring a 3D camera into our scene so that we can tell our render 3D node exactly which parts of our 3D scene we want to appear in our viewer. So we've got our camera 3D right here. We've got our focal length at 35 millimeters, and we've also made some adjustments to our Y and Z values in our translation. We've also added on 2 different lights right here. We've got our directional light and we've got our ambient light. Typically, you're going to want a general light level for any kind of 3D scene, unless you're going for something very, very moody. And even then, you'll typically still add some kind of default brightness. So let's get rid of our directional light. We're going to leave just the ambient light in there. Let's add lights in and shadows. Let's go to our render 3D, see what that looks like. So we get rid of our directional light and we keep just our ambient light, and you can see that by itself, it is lighting things up just a little bit. This is where, back in our text 3D node, if we go to shading, this is where our specular color and our bevel material begin to come in, because these controls will allow us to adjust exactly how the light interacts with our 3D text. So you can see I've made some adjustments to our bevel material. That is not exactly how our color is. And we've also brought our specular intensity up. Now, this is what our text looks like with just the ambient light. What happens if we add in our directional light and we get rid of the ambient? Now you see we've got some much harsher shadows. And you can see that even in our directional light controls, the shadows are something that we do actually have control over. So between our ambient light and our directional light, we had to be very, very precise with adjusting the intensity to make sure that we get the right levels of ambient light around everything and the right length and darkness of our shadows. If I pull our ambient light all the way up to 1, this is what happens. Everything kind of becomes blown out and the whole render becomes essentially useless. If I pull my intensity of my directional light down, you can see that, again, we start to destroy our scene. Our directional light, however, is something that we're going to play around with. In order for us to get the exact shadows that we want, and that we also have in our reference, we needed to make some very, very precise adjustments to the angle of our directional light. You're going to notice we have 2 different keyframes here, and that is because as our shadows begin to retract back into our text, I wanted to artificially increase the speed that the shadows were retracting. And you'll be able to see right here, the way I did that was by keyframing our X and Y angle and then just slowly adjusting the angle to be ever so slightly facing our text at a more direct angle. And what this does is it does actually shorten the shadows down. So when our text is already moving back, our shadows are getting shorter. And then when we enhance that using our directional light, it makes that retraction much more pronounced, much more aggressive, and ends up selling the effect much better than if we just set up our directional light all by itself and then kind of left it. And this is one of the reasons why light is so important. You can entirely control the mood, you can control the entire feel of a scene using just your lights. And almost as important as that is how we're going to render our lights. So in our render 3D node, normally the settings that you have are you have your renderer type set to software renderer. Well, you've probably already noticed that when you've got your hardware type set to software renderer, your text looks like this. It's all mangled to all hell. And this is where changing the way that our lights are rendered comes in. When we change from software renderer to hardware renderer, and of course we make sure to keep our lighting and shadows enabled, we end up with something a lot more desirable, right? So here's our lighting, here's our shadows. If I keep both of these off and we switch to software, right, you're going to see we get no shadows at all. We do get our lighting, but we get no shadows. Software to hardware, if you're ever having trouble rendering something out or it doesn't look how it's supposed to, right, for example, no shadows, play around, switch from software to hardware, make sure you have lighting and shadows enabled, and that should solve a lot of basic issues. We also disabled our anti-aliasing, low quality, high quality, don't need that. And I believe we also checked off wireframe anti-aliasing if we don't already have that checked off. Look at us so far. We've got our Netflix text animated, we've got the color animated, we've set our material properly, we've lit up the whole thing to look exactly like our reference, and we've even got a nice 3D background that it can interact with and come out looking awesome because we set up our render 3D properly. Now, we need to be a little bit creative because you can see we've got the classic Netflix curve on just the bottom of the word Netflix. The top is completely straight. The bottom, however, is custom curved. And the way we're going to do that is with a displace node. Now, a displace node, for those of you who don't know, we've used this a whole bunch of times on the channel before in making other effects. A displace node allows you to take the information that you currently have and warp it using information that you feed it to give yourself some kind of really cool custom warp effects. In our case, we want to very subtly push up the edge of our text without affecting the top and without destroying our background and our shadows. And so the way we were able to do that was by changing our displace type from radial to XY. The reason we're changing from radial to XY is because radial is going to have an overall displacement or warping effect, whereas XY is going to give us custom control on if we want things warping side to side or up and down. And in our case, we only want warping up and down. And so because of that, we are leaving our X offset and our X refraction at 0, but we're going to bring up our Y offset and we're going to bring down our Y refraction for our warping effect. What we need to do now is actually feed the information into our displace to tell it exactly what information we want to use to warp it. And what we're using right here is a very simple ellipse node. So when I plug this into our displace, you're going to see it pushes the entire thing up. And that is because everything inside of the white area on our ellipse is what we are making the choice to displace. And you can see we've got inverted, unchecked, and we've brought our soft edge up a bit. So the lesson that you can take away from using any kind of shape to warp something when you're using a displace is that the harder the edge, the more aggressively you're going to warp your information. But when you soften that edge out, you'll notice we still get to keep the majority of our width, just like we do in our reference. And then because our actual text changes size as well, we've animated both the width and the height properties to slowly adjust with our 3D text. And so now, having confidently recreated the entire thing 100% using the native tools inside of DaVinci Resolve, it's time to take a look at how our final product lines up with our reference. Comment below to let me know what kind of effects you want to see us make next. We've got some TV show stuff in the works. We've got video games, movies, all kinds of other awesome and crazy effects. Tons and tons of high quality content coming your way. Thank you everyone so much for watching. If you want the project files, they will be available down below. Like the video, share it with a friend who's really bad at 3D, and I will see you guys in the next video.